They said Christopher Pettiet had the dazzling face of Brad Pitt and the haunted eyes of River Phoenix. But he wouldn't just share their looks. He would inherit Phoenix's tragic ending. He was the prince of millions of girls' dreams. Yet, he died alone in his own dream. 24 years old, a night of partying, a dose of tranquilizer, and in an instant, the heart of this American idol stopped beating, transforming a fiery symbol of youth into a cold corpse in his familiar bed. Christopher Lee Pettiet was not merely a participant in the entertainment industry. He was, for a brief and blinding moment, its perfect currency. Born in Dallas on February 12, 1976, he arrived in Los Angeles not as a wide-eyed tourist, but as a natural resource waiting to be mined. Unlike the carefully groomed nepotism babies who cluttered the waiting rooms of Century City, children of producers and directors who treated fame as a birthright, Christopher carried a different energy. It was the energy of the found object, the diamond pulled from the rough earth of Texas. He was a high reactive child, vibrating at a frequency that normal life couldn't accommodate. In the flat, mundane suburbs of Dallas, his charisma was a disruption. In the sound stages of Burbank, it was gold. When he walked into an audition room in 1989, the atmosphere changed. This is not hyperbole. It is the specific, quantifiable physics of the casting process. Casting directors are tired people. They spend their days watching an endless parade of identical boys with identical haircuts, reciting identical lines with the robotic precision of trained seals. They are desperate to be woken up. Christopher woke them up. He didn't enter the room with the desperate, tap-dancing energy of a child begging for approval. He entered with a slouch. He entered with a quietness that forced the adults to lean in. He possessed an innate understanding of the power of the withholding. He didn't give you everything at once. He kept a piece of himself back, hidden behind eyes that seemed decades older than his birth certificate. It was the old soul quality, the same tragic weight that sat on the shoulders of River Phoenix, the same haunting resonance that would eventually consume Brad Renfro. It was the look of a boy who has already seen the ending of the movie and knows it doesn't end well. Hollywood, in its infinite hunger, devoured him immediately. There was no long, agonizing period of struggle, no years of waiting tables or parking cars. The machine recognized its own kind. By 1990, he was already working, cutting his teeth on the standard fare of the era. Star Trek: The Next Generation, Doogie Howser, MD. But these were just warm-ups, the industry testing the merchandise to ensure it didn't break under the lights. He passed every test. He could memorize dialogue instantly. He could hit his marks. He could cry on cue, and more importantly, he could stop crying when the director yelled, "Cut." He was a professional child, a distinct psychological species, bred for the consumption of strangers. But the true initiation, the moment Christopher Pettiet ceased to be a boy from Texas and became a property of Hollywood, happened on the set of The Young Riders. The show was a high-concept Western, a brat pack on horseback that gathered the most promising young male talent of the generation and put them in leather chaps and dusters. It was a factory of testosterone and ambition. Christopher was cast as the young Jesse James. The role required him to play a boy forced to grow up too fast in a violent world, a narrative that would eerily mirror his own life in Los Angeles. On the set of The Young Riders, Christopher was the little brother in a wolf pack. He was surrounded by actors like Josh Brolin and Stephen Baldwin, men who were in their 20s, who had already tasted the forbidden fruits of fame, who were living fast and hard. For a 14-year-old boy, this environment was intoxicating. It was a masterclass in swagger. He watched how the older men walked, how they talked to women, how they commanded respect from the crew. He soaked it up like a sponge, but he also soaked up the darkness. He saw the pressure. He saw the way the studio executives looked at the actors not as artists, but as racehorses, valuable only as long as they could run, disposable the moment they pulled a muscle. His performance as Jesse James was startlingly raw. In a genre often defined by caricature, the white hats versus the black hats, Christopher brought a shade of gray that was mesmerizing. He played Jesse not as a villain, but as a lost boy looking for a father figure, looking for a family, and finding only guns. There are scenes in that series where the camera lingers on his face, and you can see the internal architecture of his talent. It wasn't acting in the sense of pretending, it was being. He was channeling his own displacement, his own loneliness of being a child in an adult's world, into the character. The critics noticed. The industry noticed. The word prodigy began to circulate in the executive dining rooms of Burbank. This brings us to the precipice of 1991, the year the trap snapped shut. The script for Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead was making the rounds. On paper, it was a standard summer comedy, a chaotic farce about unsupervised children. But the role of Zach Crandall required something specific. It required a boy who could be effortlessly cool, who could charm his way out of trouble, who could wear a chef's uniform and make it look like high fashion. It required a heartthrob. When Christopher Pettiet auditioned for Zach, he didn't just win the role, he defined it. He redefined the archetype of the cool younger brother. Before Christopher, that archetype was often nerdy or annoying. Christopher made it aspirational. He created a character that every boy wanted to be and every girl wanted to save. But beneath the surface of this rising trajectory, the psychological cracks were already forming, invisible to the naked eye but structural in nature. To be a child star is to live in a state of permanent dissociation. There is the you that exists in the quiet of your bedroom, the boy who misses his friends in Texas, the boy who is afraid of the dark, the boy who just wants to ride his bike. And then there is the product, the Christopher Pettiet, who belongs to the public. The product must always be happy. The product must always be grateful. The product must never be tired. Christopher learned early on that love was conditional. The directors loved him when he got the shot. The producers loved him when the ratings were high. The fans loved him when he looked perfect. This creates a terrifying logic in the developing brain of a teenager. I am only worthy of love when I am performing. When I stop, I disappear. This was the root of the anxiety that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. He was building a career on a fault line. As filming began for Don't Tell Mom, Christopher was thrust into the center of the Hollywood social machine. He was invited to the parties. He was photographed at the premieres. He was 15, but he was living the life of a 30-year-old playboy. The industry has a way of erasing age when it is convenient. If you can make money like an adult, you are treated like an adult until you make a mistake, and then you are suddenly just a troubled kid again. The atmosphere of Los Angeles in 1991 was specific and dangerous. The hair metal scene of the Sunset Strip was dying, choking on its own hairspray and excess. In its place, a darker, grittier club scene was emerging in the shadows of the Sunset Strip. It was heroin. It was cocaine. It was authentic. The drugs weren't just for partying. They were part of the aesthetic. To be tortured was to be deep. To be high was to be connected. Christopher, with his sensitive soul and his desperate need to belong, was walking into a buzzsaw. He bonded with the cast of Don't Tell Mom, particularly Keith Coogan, grandson of Jackie Coogan, the original child star whose exploitation was so severe it led to the creation of child labor laws in Hollywood. The irony is suffocating. Here was the descendant of the first victim of the industry, working alongside the next victim. They were a tribe of lost boys, navigating a world that wanted to consume them. On set, they were professionals. Off set, they were teenagers, with too much money and no supervision. The shoot was grueling. Comedy is technical. It requires precision. Christopher worked long hours, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer terror of failure. He knew even then that this was his shot. If this movie hit, he would be made for life. If it flopped, he would be back in Dallas with it in a month. The stakes were absolute. This pressure cooker environment is not designed for the human nervous system, certainly not for a teenager who's still trying to figure out who he is. As the release date approached, the marketing machine kicked into high gear. Christopher's face was everywhere. He was on the cover of Teen Beat, Bop, Tiger Beat. He was interviewed on talk shows. He was asked the same inane questions over and over again. What's your favorite color? Do you have a girlfriend? What's it like to kiss Christina Applegate? He learned to answer them with a smile, to give the sound bites that the machine required. He learned to flatten himself into a two-dimensional image. But in the quiet moments, in the trailer between takes, or in the car ride home to the empty apartment in the valley, the silence was deafening. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only famous people know, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who want something from you. Christopher began to feel the weight of the Golden Boy label. It is a heavy crown. It requires you to be perfect. It requires you to be frozen in time. The world saw a smiling teenager on a movie poster. They didn't see the anxiety attacks. They didn't see the insomnia. They didn't see the growing reliance on chemical assistance to get through the day, to turn on the charm, to be the Christopher Pettiet that everyone expected. He was drinking a slow-acting poison, and it tasted exactly like success. By the time the movie premiered in the summer of 1991, Christopher Pettiet was arguably the most promising young actor in Hollywood. He had the reviews, the box office, and the look. He was poised to take the throne. He was supposed to be the one who made it. He was supposed to be the survivor. But Hollywood loves a tragedy even more than it loves a success. And as the camera flashed on the red carpet, capturing that radiant golden smile, it was also capturing the beginning of the end. The boy who was waving to the crowd was already disappearing, pixel by pixel, replaced by a legend that would eventually become a ghost story. The sun was at its zenith, casting no shadows, but the sunset was coming faster than anyone, especially Christopher, could have imagined. He was standing on the peak of the mountain, unaware that the only way forward was down. Before the inevitable descent, there was a moment of absolute apex. The summer of 1991 was a cultural pivot point. While Nirvana's Nevermind was preparing to wash away the 80s, the sun was still shining on a specific brand of chaotic optimism. Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead was expected to be a modest sleeper hit, yet it became a generational touchstone, with Christopher Pettiet as the lightning rod that grounded the entire electric storm. The catalyst was the character itself. Zach Crandall was not written as a hero. In the script, he was the slacker, the stoner-adjacent younger brother, the chaos agent. But Christopher performed a kind of alchemy on the role. He imbued Zach with a soulful charisma that transcended the annoying brother archetype. When Zach Crandall wore a chef's uniform to work at a fast food joint, Christopher made it look like couture. When he smirked at the camera, he wasn't just breaking the fourth wall, he was inviting the audience into a conspiracy. The reaction was immediate and visceral. For millions of teenagers in 1991, Christopher Pettiet didn't just become a star, he became the primary imprint of desire. He was accessible. He wasn't the distant, muscle-bound action hero like Schwarzenegger. He was the boy you could theoretically meet at the mall. He was the boy next door, provided you lived in a neighborhood zoned for movie stars. The box office numbers were solid, but the cultural penetration was absolute. Christopher went from being a working actor to a teen idol in the span of a single weekend. The term teen idol is often used dismissively, but it describes a state of existence that is psychologically hazardous. It means that your identity is no longer your own. It is crowdsourced. You become a vessel for the fantasies of strangers. For a 15-year-old boy, this level of adoration is a powerful narcotic. It rewires the dopamine pathways. Christopher couldn't walk down the street without turning heads. He couldn't eat a burger without being watched. The privacy of his childhood didn't just erode, it evaporated. He was living in a fishbowl where the glass was made of magazine covers. The engine that drove this fame was the teen magazine industry. In the pre-internet era, publications like Teen Beat, Bop, Tiger Beat, and 16 Magazine were the gatekeepers of relevance. They were the Instagram and TikTok of their day, possessing the power to make or break a career with a single centerfold. In 1991 and 1992, Christopher Pettiet was the undisputed king of the newsstand. The editors of these magazines knew exactly what they were doing. They airbrushed his flaws. They edited his quotes to make him sound more romantic, more available, more perfect. They constructed a Christopher Pettiet that was a fictional character, a composite sketch of the perfect boyfriend. This paper Christopher loved animals, respected his mother, and was looking for a girl just like you. The real Christopher was a complex, high-energy, increasingly anxious teenager living in the pressure cooker of Los Angeles. The dissonance between the paper Christopher and the real Christopher began to create a fracture in his psyche. He was being celebrated for a version of himself that didn't exist. He was selling a lie, and every time he signed an autograph, he felt the weight of that fraudulence. The industry demanded access. Photo shoots became his second job. He spent hours posing against bright-colored backgrounds, holding props that had nothing to do with his life: beach balls, electric guitars, puppies. He was asked to smile until his face cramped. "Give us the smirk, Chris. Give us the Zach Crandall look." He was being trained to perform his own identity on command. This is a dangerous lesson for a developing mind. Your natural state is not enough. You must be the character, even when the cameras aren't rolling. The money was pouring in. The residuals from Don't Tell Mom and the salary from the young writers made him rich. But wealth for a child star is an abstraction. It is managed by adults, discussed in meetings he is too bored to attend, and ultimately serves to isolate him from his peers. He couldn't relate to the kids back in Texas anymore. Their problems, homework, varsity football, prom dates, seemed trivial compared to his problems. Contract negotiations, union rules, and the fear of being replaced. If Don't Tell Mom was the high, the cancellation of the Young Writers in 1992 was the crash. For 3 seasons, the show had been his anchor. It was a steady job, a routine. It required him to wake up early, go to the set, ride horses, and say lines. It gave his life structure. The cancellation of a long-running show is a traumatic event for a child actor. It is the dissolution of a family. The cast and crew he had grown up with, his surrogate brothers, fathers, and mothers, were suddenly gone. The set was struck, the costumes were archived, the illusion was dismantled. Christopher was 16 years old. He was unemployed, and he was facing the terrifying question that haunts every actor: what now? The industry had labeled him. He was the kid from Don't Tell Mom. He was the young Jesse James. In Hollywood, a label is useful for getting work until it isn't. The moment the industry decided that the Western craze was over, Christopher's experience on the Young Riders went from being an asset to a liability. He hit the audition circuit again, but the room had changed. He wasn't the fresh face anymore. He was a known quantity. And worse, he was growing up. The years 1992 and 1993 marked the beginning of Christopher's awkward phase. It is a cruel biological reality that the very thing that makes a child star successful, their cuteness, their softness, their malleability, is destroyed by time. Christopher was stretching out. His face was thinning. The adorable roundness of Zach Crandall was being replaced by the angularity of a young man. His voice was settling. He was no longer a boy, but he wasn't quite a man. He was in the uncanny valley of adolescence. Casting directors didn't know what to do with him. He was too young to play the romantic lead, but too old to play the son. He was too pretty to play the villain, but too edgy to play the hero. He fell into the cracks between the archetypes. He would walk into auditions for roles that he knew he could crush, only to see the producers exchange glances. They were looking for the kid on the poster. They were looking for the memory of 1991. When Christopher walked in looking like a tired 16-year-old with shadows under his eyes, they felt cheated. The rejection became personal. It wasn't just, "You're not right for the part." It felt like, "You are broken." Christopher began to internalize this. He looked in the mirror and scrutinized his own face, searching for the flaw that was making the phone stop ringing. Was his nose too big? Was he too short? Was he not grunge enough? Culturally, the ground was shifting beneath his feet. By 1993, the polished aesthetic of the late 80s and early 90s was dead. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden had taken over. The new ideal of male beauty was greasy, unkempt, and visibly damaged. Christopher tried to pivot. He grew his hair out. He started wearing flannel. He tried to adopt the grunge look, but on him it looked like a costume. He was naturally radiant. He had to work hard to look dirty. This attempt to chase the trend was a sign of desperation. He was reacting to the market rather than defining it. This period marked the beginning of his descent into the darker side of Los Angeles nightlife. If the industry wouldn't give him the validation he needed, the clubs would. Los Angeles in the early 90s had a thriving underground club scene that catered to the young Hollywood elite. It was a closed ecosystem. To get in, you had to be someone. And Christopher was still someone. The bouncers lifted the velvet ropes. The bartenders poured the drinks. He fell in with a clique of other young actors who were in the same boat, too famous for school, too idle for work. They were the lost boys of the Sunset Strip. They had money, time, and no supervision. The drug use started as it always does, casually. It was social. A line of cocaine in the bathroom of the Viper Room wasn't seen as a death wish. It was seen as a cup of coffee. It was a way to stay awake, to stay charming, to keep up with the frantic energy of the night. It was a way to numb the stinging rejection of the day's auditions. Christopher discovered that when he was high, the anxiety vanished. The voice in his head that asked, "Am I good enough?" went silent. The chemicals provided the confidence that the industry was stripping away. Cocaine made him feel like the golden boy again. It restored the feeling of 1991. But the party culture of LA is a predator. It requires a sacrifice. It feeds on youth. Christopher was surrounded by friends who were really just drinking buddies, leeches, and dealers. They didn't care about his career. They cared that he was paying the tab. They cared that he had the car. The erosion of support back home, the dynamic was shifting. His parents, who had moved to LA to support his dream, were now managing a crisis they were ill-equipped to handle. How do you discipline a teenager who pays the mortgage? How do you ground a child who is legally emancipated in the eyes of the industry? The power dynamic in the Pettiet household was inverted. Christopher was the breadwinner. He was the star. This creates a terrifying isolation. A child needs parents who can say no. But when the parents are also the employees, no becomes a dangerous word. Christopher began to drift away from his family. He spent more time crashing on friends' couches, staying in hotels, disappearing for days at a time. He was seeking a tribe that understood him, but he was looking in the sewers. By the end of 1993, the first phase of Christopher Pettiet's career was officially over. The teen idol years were dead. The posters were being taken down from bedroom walls, replaced by images of Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder. The world had moved on. Christopher was left standing in the wreckage of his own success, holding a resume that felt like ancient history. He was 17 years old, and he was already a has-been in the eyes of the brutal Hollywood machine. But he wasn't ready to give up. He still had the talent. He still had the hunger. He decided to fight back. He decided to reinvent himself. He didn't know it yet, but he was entering the most dangerous phase of his life. He was about to step off the pedestal and into the trenches of the B-movie circuit, a world of desperation, exploitation, and shadows where the drugs were harder, the nights were longer, and the safety net was non-existent. The golden boy was gone, the struggling artist was born, and the clock was ticking louder than ever. When the doors to the major studios began to close, Christopher didn't simply stop acting. He was forced to migrate. He moved from the penthouse of pop culture to the basement, entering a gritty, subterranean world of B-movies and direct-to-video thrillers. It was here, in the shadows of the industry, that the lines between his on-screen desperation and his off-screen reality began to blur dangerously. If the years 1991 and 1992 were a montage of flashbulbs and red carpets, the period from 1994 to 1996 was a slow-motion study in professional claustrophobia. Christopher Pettiet had graduated from the protected incubator of network television and studio films into the feral wilderness of the independent and B-movie market. This transition is a common trajectory for child stars, but that doesn't make it any less psychologically violent. It is a demotion that feels like a death sentence. The roles changed. He was no longer the lovable rogue or the innocent victim. He was cast as the delinquent, the drifter, the junkie. This shift wasn't just a reflection of his maturing features. It was a reflection of how the industry now viewed him. He had lost the glow. He was now gritty. And in the lexicon of Hollywood casting, gritty is often a polite euphemism for damaged. He appeared in films like Relentless 4, Ashes to Ashes and Boys. These were not films that premiered at Mann's Chinese Theater. These were films that found their audience on the shelves of Blockbuster Video on a Friday night, rented by people looking for a cheap thrill. The production values were lower. The scripts were thinner. The catering was worse. But Christopher worked. He worked with a desperation that was painful to watch. He treated every role, no matter how small or derivative, as if it were Hamlet. There is a tragedy in watching a racehorse pull a plow. Christopher possessed a talent that was subtle and reactive, but these films demanded broad strokes and melodrama. He was overqualified and underutilized. He would deliver a line with genuine pathos, only to have the director yell, "Cut! Louder, Chris, more anger." They didn't want nuance. They wanted noise. As the professional validation dried up, Christopher sought solace in the one place where he still felt like royalty, the nightclub scene. By 1994, the Viper Room on Sunset Boulevard had become the epicenter of young Hollywood cool. It was owned by Johnny Depp, a figure who represented everything Christopher wanted to be: an artist who had successfully transitioned from teen idol to serious actor, all while maintaining a mysterious, rebellious edge. The Viper Room was dark, loud, and exclusive. It was a sanctuary where the famous could be infamous without judgment. For Christopher, it was a home. He knew the doormen, he knew the bartenders, he knew the dealers. Inside those black walls, the fact that his last movie went straight to video didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there. But the Viper Room was also a graveyard. It was the place where River Phoenix had collapsed and died on the sidewalk in the early hours of Halloween, 1993. River's death should have been a wake-up call, a blaring siren warning the industry of the dangers of excess. Instead, it became a dark mythos. River was canonized as a saint of the grunge era. His death didn't stop the party. It just made the party feel more dangerous, more real. Christopher idolized River Phoenix. They shared a similar energy, a similar look, and a similar struggle against the commodification of their souls. In a twisted way, the proximity to River's ghost at the Viper Room validated Christopher's own spiral. He was walking in the footsteps of a legend. He began to romanticize his own pain, viewing his drug use not as an addiction, but as a rite of passage for the tortured artist. By 1995, recreational use hardened into chemical dependency. Christopher wasn't using drugs to party in the hedonistic sense. He was using them to survive. He was self-medicating a profound and untreated anxiety disorder. The pressure to succeed, the fear of failure, the humiliation of rejection, these created a constant humming noise in his head. Alcohol turned down the volume. Cocaine gave him the energy to fake confidence. Painkillers numbed the deep, aching loneliness that settled in his chest when the sun went down. He became a master of chemistry. He knew exactly what to take to get up in the morning, what to take to get through a meeting, and what to take to sleep at night. He was managing his own neurochemistry like a sound engineer mixing a track. But the tolerance was building. The up required more powder. The down required more pills. He was pushing his body to the limit, running the engine in the red zone every single day. His appearance began to change. The fresh-faced boy from Don't Tell Mom was gone. He looked tired. His skin was pale. He lost weight. In the grunge era, this look, heroin chic, was fashionable. The fashion industry, led by photographers like Corinne Day and David Sorrenti, was celebrating the aesthetic of wasting away. Christopher's decline was camouflaged by the trend. When people saw him looking gaunt and shadow-eyed, they didn't think sickness, they thought cool. The tragedy of addiction is never a solo act. It requires a supporting cast. Christopher was surrounded by enablers. There were the friends who were always ready to party, who never asked how he was really doing, who viewed his drug stash as a communal resource. There were the agents and managers who saw the signs, but chose to look away as long as he showed up to the set on time. But the most dangerous enablers were the doctors. Los Angeles in the 90s was awash in doctor feel-goods, physicians who viewed their prescription pads as ATMs. They catered to the wealthy and the famous, trading Vicodin and Valium for cash and proximity to fame. Christopher didn't have to buy drugs in a back alley. He could walk into a sterile medical office in Beverly Hills, complain of back pain or insomnia, and walk out with a bottle of synthetic heroin. This medicalization of his addiction gave it a veneer of legitimacy. He wasn't a junkie shooting up under a bridge. He was a patient taking medicine prescribed by a doctor. It allowed him to maintain a level of denial that was impenetrable. It's legal, he could tell himself. It's for my back. The year 1996 marked a low point. The work had almost completely dried up. Christopher appeared in a TV movie called Terminal, a title that felt grimly appropriate. He was 20 years old, and he felt washed up. He began to retreat. He stopped going to the high-profile parties. He started spending more time alone or with a smaller, darker circle of friends. The isolation fed the depression. He would spend days in his apartment, curtains drawn, watching old movies, getting high, and wondering where it all went wrong. He watched as his peers, actors like Leonardo DiCaprio, ascended to the stratosphere. DiCaprio starred in Romeo plus Juliet in 1996, cementing his status as a serious actor and a global heartthrob. Christopher watched from the sidelines. He knew he had the talent to be Romeo. He knew he had the look. But the phone didn't ring for him. The jealousy was corrosive. It wasn't a malicious envy. It was a mournful one. He grieved for the career he was supposed to have. He grieved for the version of himself that died in 1992. In late 1997 and 1998, Christopher made a conscious effort to pivot. He realized that the boy wonder was dead. He needed to become a character actor. He needed to embrace the grit. He started taking acting classes again. He tried to strip away the affectations of his youth. He wanted to learn the craft, not just the tricks. He started looking for roles that were ugly, roles that required him to disappear. He landed a dramatic guest role on the TV show Chicago Hope. It wasn't glamorous, but it was respectable. It was adult work. He played a patient, a role that required vulnerability. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of the old spark. He remembered why he loved acting. It wasn't about the fame. It was about the connection. It was about the ability to tell the truth through a lie. But the industry was still skeptical. They saw the baggage. They saw the troubled kid reputation. He had to fight for every inch of ground. He had to audition for roles that were beneath him, just to prove he was reliable. As the 90s drew to a close, Christopher Pettiet was a survivor of the first wave of his own life. He had survived the fame, the crash, and the initial descent into addiction. He was still standing. He was still fighting. But the damage had been done. His body was tired. His heart, stressed by years of stimulants and depressants, was weakening. He was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and the wind was picking up. He didn't know it, but he was entering the final act. The millennium was approaching, the year 2000, a symbolic turning point for the world. For Christopher, it represented a chance for a new beginning. He told friends he wanted to get clean. He wanted to direct. He wanted to write. He had dreams again. Hope is a dangerous thing for an addict. It can be a motivator, but it can also be a blinder. It can make you believe you are invincible right at the moment you are most vulnerable. Christopher was about to step into the light of a false dawn, unaware that the long night was already closing in. As the 1990s bled into the new millennium, the cultural landscape shifted once again, leaving the grunge aesthetic behind for something shinier and more synthetic. Christopher stood at this crossroads, a veteran at 23 trying to find his footing in a world that was rapidly rewriting its own rules. He was looking for a second act, unaware that he was already walking through the final scenes of his third. The late 1990s were a period of tectonic shifts in pop culture, where the moody, flannel-clad introspection of grunge was being aggressively displaced by the shiny, manufactured optimism of the teen pop explosion. Britney Spears, NSYNC, and the Backstreet Boys were turning the dial back to a technicolor frequency that Hollywood hadn't seen since the 1950s. For an actor like Christopher Pettiet, whose aesthetic had curdled into the grunge ideal of the beautiful loser, this shift was disorienting. He was a relic of an era that had only just ended, a veteran of a war that everyone else had seemingly forgotten. He was 21, then 22, ages that should represent the prime of youth, yet In the accelerated timeline of Hollywood, he felt ancient. He carried the weariness of a man who had already lived a full career arc, rise, peak, and fall, before he was legally allowed to rent a car without a surcharge. His filmography during these years reads like a map of the industry's back alleys. He appeared in films with titles that sounded like warnings: Against the Law, Tracks, Judgment Day. These were productions that existed on the periphery of the business, financed by patchwork deals and shot on tight schedules in nondescript locations. Yet, Christopher's commitment never wavered. Watch him in these forgotten tapes. There is a scene in a low-budget thriller where he simply sits at a table smoking a cigarette, listening to another character speak. In that silence, you see the actor he could have been. He doesn't fidget. He doesn't mug for the camera. He listens with an intensity that pulls the focus of the scene entirely to him. It is a masterclass in minimalism, performed in a movie that likely played on cable television at 3 a.m. It is the tragedy of the virtuoso playing a Stradivarius in a subway station, while commuters rush by, too busy to notice the music. By 1998, the strain of maintaining this professional facade while battling a private chemical war began to show in subtle, heartbreaking ways. The party had stopped being a celebration and had become a maintenance routine. The joy of the high was gone, replaced by the necessity of the fix. Christopher was no longer chasing euphoria. He was chasing normal. He needed the substances just to reach a baseline where he could function, where he could look a producer in the eye and smile, where he could memorize a page of dialogue without his hands shaking. This is the stage of addiction that is rarely glamorized in movies, the sheer grinding drudgery of it. It is a full-time job with a demanding boss who lives in your own blood. His social circle began to contract. The A-list friends, the ones who had successfully transitioned to adult careers, drifted away. They were busy with Oscars and magazine covers. Christopher found himself surrounded by the lifers of the Hollywood fringe, older actors who had never made it, musicians waiting for a break that would never come, and the hangers-on who fed off the fading heat of his former fame. These people didn't challenge him. They didn't ask him to get better. They accepted him as he was, broken and generous. In this ecosystem, Christopher was still a star. He picked up the checks. He provided the connections. He was the benevolent prince of a kingdom of lost souls. But beneath the stagnation, there was a flicker of resilience. In 1999, Christopher made a decision that surprised everyone. He started talking about the future with genuine excitement. He began to express an interest in the other side of the camera. He talked about writing. He talked about directing. This is a common pivot for actors who feel trapped by their own faces. If the industry wouldn't cast him, he reasoned, he would cast himself. He would build his own table. This shift in perspective, from object to creator, gave him a renewed sense of agency. He wasn't just waiting for the phone to ring anymore. He was thinking about making the call. This renewed optimism coincided with a role in the MTV series Undressed. The show was an anthology, a candid look at the sexual lives of young adults. It wasn't high art. It was soapy, provocative, and aimed squarely at the TRL generation. But it was culturally relevant. It was watched by the demographic that mattered. For Christopher, getting cast in Undressed in 1999 felt like a bridge back to relevance. He was playing a character his own age, dealing with adult relationships. He looked good. He looked healthy. To the casual observer, it seemed like the prodigal son was returning. The year 1999 bled into the year 2000 with the apocalyptic hype of Y2K. The world was obsessed with the idea of a digital crash, a global reset. Christopher, too, seemed poised for a reset. He turned 24 in February of 2000. 24 is a pivotal age. You are no longer a kid. The early 20s excuse begins to evaporate. You are staring down the barrel of genuine adulthood. Christopher seemed to understand this. He told friends he felt like he was turning a corner. He was looking at scripts again. He was taking meetings. The fog of the mid-90s seemed to be lifting. But addiction is a patient hunter. It doesn't disappear just because you have a good week or a good month or a good year. It waits in the neural pathways, a dormant code ready to execute the moment vigilance drops. The danger of the upswing is often underestimated. When an addict is at rock bottom, they are cautious because they know they are dying. When they are doing better, they become confident. They think they can handle just one night. They think they have conquered the beast, when in reality they have just put it in a cage with a flimsy lock. In the spring of 2000, Christopher Pettiet was walking this dangerous line. He was happy. This is the cruelest detail of the narrative. He wasn't suicidal. He wasn't in the depths of a depressive episode. He was optimistic. He had just booked a small role in a film. He had money in the bank. He had friends who loved him. He was making plans for the summer. The narrative of the tortured artist seeking death does not fit here. This was a young man seeking life, but using a flawed map to find it. The culture of Los Angeles in 2000 was shifting again. The grunge era was dead, replaced by the new metal aggression of Limp Bizkit and the bling era of hip-hop. The drugs changed too. Prescription pills began to flood the market with unprecedented availability. OxyContin had hit the market in 1996, changing the landscape of opioid abuse forever. But the older staples, Vicodin, Valium, Darvon, were still the currency of the Hollywood night. These pills were seen as cleaner than heroin. They came in blister packs. They were manufactured by pharmaceutical giants. They felt safe. By the spring of 2000, the regimen had become routine. Stimulants to work, depressants to rest. A dangerous cycle he rationalized as professional maintenance rather than addiction. This denial was the most powerful force in his arsenal, allowing him to walk willingly toward the edge, convinced he was still in control. It allows brilliant, sensitive people to walk willingly into their own destruction, convinced they are in control until the very moment the lights go out. April 2000 arrived with the mild, deceptive sunshine of a California spring. Christopher was in high spirits. He attended the Los Angeles Music Awards. He was seen at industry events, smiling, shaking hands, looking like the Christopher Pettiet of 1991, just a little older, a little wiser. He was reconnecting with people. He was rebuilding bridges. On the night of April 11th, 2000, Christopher went out. It wasn't a bender in the traditional sense. It wasn't a scene from a cautionary tale about rock and roll excess. It was a Tuesday, a standard, unremarkable Tuesday in Los Angeles. He met up with friends. They went to a house party. The atmosphere was casual. There was music. There was laughter. There were drugs. In this environment, consumption was communal and casual. A line of cocaine here, a pill there. It was passed around like hors d'oeuvres. Christopher partook. He was celebrating. He was feeling good. The cocaine provided that familiar electric rush, the feeling that he was the most charming person in the room, the feeling that his brain was firing on all cylinders. It was the feeling of being Zach Crandall again, effortless and cool. But the night has a rhythm. The up must eventually be followed by the down. As the party wound down in the early hours of April 12th, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the jittery, hollow exhaustion of the stimulant crash. The birds were starting to chirp, that terrible judging sound that every night owl dreads. Christopher wanted to sleep. He needed to sleep. He had things to do the next day. He had a life to live. He went home. His apartment was quiet. He was alone. The silence that he had spent years trying to outrun was waiting for him. His heart was racing from the cocaine, thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. His mind was racing, replaying conversations, analyzing the night. He needed to switch it off. He went to his medicine cabinet and found a bottle of propoxyphene, commonly known as Darvon. He didn't want to die. He simply wanted to sleep. He took the pills, performed the mundane rituals of bedtime, and climbed into bed. The script for his next role sat on the nightstand. He closed his eyes, trusting that biology would do what it always did: reset, recharge, and wake him up in the morning. He drifted into a deep, heavy sleep, unaware that inside his chest a silent and fatal chemical collision was about to begin. As the sun rose over Los Angeles on the morning of April 12, 2000, the city began its daily grind. Casting directors drove to their offices. Agents picked up their phones. The machine that Christopher had given his life to began to hum and whir, hungry for fresh meat. But in a quiet bedroom, the boy who had once been its favorite son lay still. The golden boy was gone. The next big thing had become the last big thing. And the world, busy with its own noise, hadn't even noticed that the music had stopped. By the afternoon, the silence in his apartment shifted from peaceful to ominous. In a city like Los Angeles that never truly stops, such stillness is a warning. When a friend finally entered the room, the cinematic drama Christopher had enacted all his life was absent. There was no crashing score, no slow-motion scream, only the quiet, devastating reality of a life interrupted mid-sentence. The paramedics were summoned, but their arrival was a mere formality. The battle against time had been lost hours ago. There was no rush to the hospital, no sirens wailing down the 405 freeway. The scene transitioned rapidly into a procedural inquiry as the Los Angeles County Coroner's van arrived, a white, nondescript vehicle that serves as the final limousine for the city's fallen stars. They collected the body of the 24-year-old actor, placing him into a bag that erased his identity, reducing the next Brad Pitt to case number 2000-02815. The subsequent police sweep of the apartment was routine. The police swept the apartment. They found the remnants of the previous night, the residue of the party, the prescription bottles. It was a tableau familiar to any detective working the Hollywood beat. A young man, a fast life, and a medicine cabinet that looked like a pharmacy. But there was no suicide note. There were no signs of a struggle. The apartment was orderly. It didn't look like a crime scene. It looked simply like a young man who had gone to sleep and never woke up. The toxicology report revealed the silent killer. The cause of death was an accidental overdose due to the combined effects of cocaine and propoxyphene. It was a speedball effect that creates a lethal tug-of-war on the heart. The cocaine commanded his heart to race, while the Darvon commanded it to stop. Already weakened by an enlarged heart, a common scar of chronic drug use, Christopher's body simply couldn't survive the conflict. The news of his death trickled out into the world with a heartbreaking lack of fanfare. In the pre-social media age, news traveled via wire services and trade papers. A brief obituary appeared in Variety. A short segment aired on Entertainment Tonight. The headlines were small. Former child star found dead. Actor Christopher Pettiet dies at 24. There was no outpouring of national grief. The shrines that had appeared on the sidewalk for River Phoenix 7 years earlier did not materialize for Christopher. The industry did not pause. Films continued to shoot. Casting directors continued to hold auditions. The machinery of Hollywood is unsentimental. It does not mourn the cogs that fall out of the engine. For the public, the reaction was a mixture of shock and vague recognition. "Wait, the kid from Don't Tell Mom?" people asked. "I thought he was doing okay." It was a momentary disruption in the pop culture noise, a sad piece of trivia to be discussed over coffee and then forgotten. He had been out of the spotlight just long enough to be relegated to the past tense, even before he died. But for his family, the silence was deafening. His parents were left with the unimaginable task of bearing a child who was supposed to be the golden future of the family. They had supported his dream, moved across the country for it, and watched it consume him. Now they were left with the residuals, not the money, but the memories of a boy who loved to surf, who loved his dog, who had a smile that could light up a Texas prairie. The funeral was private. It was stripped of the Hollywood glitz that had defined his adolescence. There were no red carpets, no paparazzi, just a group of grieving people standing around a casket that looked far too small for a young man. They weren't burying Zach Crandall. They were burying Christopher. In the days following the funeral, the narrative began to settle. He was categorized. He was filed away in the cabinet labeled Tragic Child Stars, placed next to Anissa Jones and Dana Plato. The complexity of his life, his talent, his humor, his kindness, his struggle with anxiety was flattened into a cautionary tale. He became a warning label for other parents. Don't let your kids go to Hollywood. Yet the tragedy of Christopher Pettiet's death was not that he was wild or reckless. It was that he was just normal. He was a normal 24-year-old navigating a high-risk environment with no safety net. He made a mistake that thousands of people make every weekend. He just happened to pay the ultimate price for it. He went to sleep with a script on his nightstand, fully intending to wake up and go to work. His death wasn't a rejection of life, it was an accident of living. But a death like this does not end at the graveside. While the physical body was laid to rest, the questions it raised continued to haunt the periphery of Hollywood. The tragedy of Christopher Pettiet demanded an answer, not just about how he died, but about why the system that created him was so ill-equipped to save him. In the vacuum left by his absence, a painful legacy began to take shape. In the wake of the silence, a quiet resistance emerged. Unlike the families of many fallen stars who retreated into the shadows of shame, Christopher's parents chose to face the industry that had consumed their son. They established a scholarship fund in his name, a desperate and noble attempt to turn a senseless loss into a safety net for the next generation. They wanted to provide young actors with the one thing Christopher never had: guidance without exploitation. It was a small beacon in a dark industry, a way to ensure that while his body was gone, his name would still aid those attempting to navigate the same treacherous waters he had drowned in. Yet the cultural erasure was swift and brutal. Christopher Pettiet occupies a liminal space in Hollywood history. He did not become a martyr like James Dean or a grunge icon like River Phoenix, whose faces still adorn t-shirts and murals. Christopher became a ghost of the what could have been. He represents the middle class of Hollywood tragedy, the talented, beautiful children who are chewed up and swallowed whole, leaving behind only a handful of credits and a fading smile on a dusty VHS cover found in a thrift store. His death serves as a cold mirror held up to the 1990s. It reflects the disposable nature of youth in an era that commodified authenticity until it became toxic. He was a boy who sold his childhood to entertain strangers, and when he tried to reclaim his autonomy, he found the cost was too high. He wasn't a rebel without a cause. He was a worker without a union, a child soldier in a war for box office receipts who was left behind on the battlefield when the troops moved on. Today, Christopher Pettiet remains forever 24, locked in the amber of 1991. He is not a symbol of rebellion, but a testament to the terrifying fragility of a life lived in the fast lane. His death was not a dramatic crash, but a quiet chemical drift into the dark. He sleeps now, safe from the casting calls, safe from the critics, finally allowed the silence that Hollywood could never provide.